An analogy has been drawn since ancient times between the human being and the larger organism of the state. The traditional conception of the state, a conception both organic and complex, has always reflected the natural hierarchy of faculties which distinguishes the complete human being. Here, the purely physical and corporeal element is supported by life forces which are governed by the life of the spirit and character, while above the whole being stands the spiritual and intellectual principle, which the Stoics refer to as the inner sovereign, the hegemonikon. Bearing these points in mind, every democracy necessarily appears as a regressive phenomenon, a system in which every normal relationship is inverted. The hegemonikon is non-existent. Determination occurs from below. A real centre is missing. This revocable pseudo-authority at the service of what lies below, i.e., of the purely material, social, economic and quantitative aspect of a people, corresponds according to this analogy to the situation in an individual being of a mind and a spiritual principle which exists solely on account of and for the sake of bodily needs. The advent of democracy, therefore, signals something far more serious than it might seem to today from a purely political perspective. That is, the mistaken foolish infatuation of a society digging its own grave. Indeed, it might be argued that the democratic climate is, in the long run, bound to exert a regressive influence on the very personality of man, even in existential terms, precisely by virtue of the aforementioned correspondences between the individual as a small organism and the state as a large organism. Confirmation of this idea may be found by examining various aspects of contemporary society. Plato has stated that those who have no master within themselves at least ought to have a master outside them. But what has been extolled as the liberation of this or that people and its democratic progress, which is brought, often even through the use of violence, as occurred after the World War, by doing away with all principles of sovereignty, all genuine authority and all order from above, is matched today in a significant number of individuals by a liberation amounting to the elimination of any inner form, any sort of character, any kind of rectitude. What we find, in other words, is the decline or absence in the individual of that central power which I have already referred to with the evocative classical denomination of hegemonikon. This does not apply to the ethical sphere alone, but also to the field of common behaviour, of individual psychology, and of one's existential structure. The result is the spread of an unstable and formless type, what may well be described as the breed of the evasive man. This is a breed that deserves to be described in more detail than I can possibly do here. A full description would even draw upon scientific and experimental methods. The type of man belonging to this breed not only cannot stand any inner discipline and hates the prospect of facing himself, but he is also incapable of taking any serious commitment, or following a well-defined line of conduct, of showing any character. Partly, he does not wish to do so, partly, he cannot. Indeed, it is interesting to note that this feebleness is not always of the unscrupulous self-serving sort, typical of the kind of man who says, in this age, one cannot afford to show any character. In many cases, the behaviour of the people in question is even detrimental to them. It is significant, moreover, that the shattered type of individual I am talking about is increasingly taking root both in places that were the least suited to it in terms of race and tradition. I am chiefly referring to Central Europe and to the Nordic countries, and to some extent to Britain too, and among classes such as the aristocracy and artisan class, whose members until just recently still preserved a certain inner form. The decline of all professional honour also reflects the same pattern of disintegration, the sort of honour which in the practical field represented a valuable expression of one's moral conscience as well as a degree of nobility. The pleasure of producing things according to one's art, by doing one's best, in an earnest and honourable fashion, is replaced by the basest kind of interest, which does not shy away from adulteration and fraud. Most typical of all are food frauds, which nowadays have become blatant and widespread as never before. And often criminal irresponsibility comes into play here, yet it is also a matter of obliqueness, of a drop of one's inner level, of the vanishing of that sense of honour which in former times distinguished even the humblest guilds. In a certain sector, parallel with industrialisation, this sense of honour is replaced by a proletarian character and by social blackmailing from the so-called working class, those mere sellers of labour. As already noted, the phenomenon does not concern the moral sphere alone. Feebleness, evasiveness, light-hearted irresponsibility and casual unfairness are also displayed in relation to trivial everyday matters of life. One promises something, to write, phone, take care of this or that, and then fails to act upon it. One is not punctual. In more serious cases, memory itself is affected, forgetfulness, absent-mindedness, a difficulty to concentrate. Specialists have noted that the young generations have a poorer memory, and various bizarre or adjunct reasons have been invoked to explain this fact. But the real cause actually lies in the aforementioned alteration of the overall climate, which would appear to be leading to a genuine alteration of people's psychological makeup. We can grasp the deeper implications of this phenomenon if we bear in mind Weininger's insightful observations on the relation between ethics, logic, and memory, on the meaning of memory on a higher rather than merely psychological level, with memory being closely associated with the unity of the human person, with its resistance to dispersion over time, to the flow of time. As such, it also possesses an ethical and ontological value, which is why a particular strengthening of memory comes into play in ascetic disciplines of a higher order, as in Buddhism, for instance. The evasive breed of man displays a natural tendency towards lying, often gratuitously so, for no real reason. This is one of its specifically feminine traits, and if someone reproaches a man of this breed on account of such behaviour, he will either react with surprise, since it comes so naturally to him, or feel irked and react with a sort of huff. Such a man does not wish to be bothered. With a little attention, one will easily find confirmation of this sort of neurosis within the circle of one's own social relations, and one will also note that many people who only yesterday seemed to be friends or men with a certain inner composure have now become, in the aftermath of the war, quite unrecognisable. It is not even worth discussing the world of petty politicians, with its wheeling and dealing and the corruption that has always been the hallmark of parliamentary democracies, but which has emerged in a particularly prominent and blatant form today. For it is all too evident just what role is played here by the breed of the evasive man, which is always the same despite its wide range of labels and parties. Indeed, it is worth noting that those professing ideas of the right often constitute no exception, since these ideas frequently make up separate compartments in such people, with no direct contact to and no practical consequences for their actual life. Rather, it is worth mentioning here the petty corruption that one finds, especially in the sexual field, among the new and emancipated generations. This goes more or less in the direction of the ideal dolce vita. The phenomenon may be traced back to the same cause, feebleness and inconstancy. It does not correspond to something genuinely nonconformist, to the affirmation of a higher sort of freedom, of a more pronounced personality. Ultimately, it is the effect of letting oneself go in a form of passiveness, a banal drop in level. I will return to this point when studying the background of certain sexological ideological currents en vogue nowadays. The space that ought to be filled by one's inner sovereign, possibly in contrast to all exterior laws, hypocrisy or lies, through the law of one's own being, i.e. Stirner, Nietzsche, Ibsen, is empty. One lives from day to day, foolishly. Hence the disgust and boredom that one feels in rare moments of awareness. The lack of an external authority and of true leaders within the organism of the state, and the lack of an inner form in the individual, the two things go hand in hand, the one strengthening the other, so much so that they may well be two different aspects of a single phenomenon marking the progressive and democratic times in which we live.